Good. Greetings all. Welcome to the launching webinar of the seminal report on just transition, a climate, energy and development vision for Africa, a report that was authored by an amazing team of African and Friends of Africa authors, and we will hear from a few of them in the webinar today. And certainly the launching webinar of this report is a real milestone in terms of the kind of intellectual contribution and robust technical contributions that Africans can make and Friends of Africa make towards finding solutions from, of course, very challenging multiple crises that this continent has faced over centuries and decades. My name is Tasneem Essop. I am the CAN International Executive Director, and I have the immense privilege of being the facilitator of this discussion today. We have, of course, as you can see on the slide, a fabulous lineup of speakers, a combination of the authors themselves, as well as a great lineup of respondents that will engage with us in a panel discussion later in the webinar itself. So I'm not going to talk much more. We have a lot to hear from the authors and others. So I will immediately hand over to our dearest friend. I suppose, yeah, I've heard that, Yuba, I've heard that we, the older generation are being called living ancestors. So if you don't mind, I'm going to welcome Yuba Sakona, who's the vice chair of the IPCC and was also the chair of the report authors group. So welcome, Yuba. Looking forward to you setting us the context of the report.
Okay, thank you, Tasneem. Good morning, as I am currently in Canada, and thank you for responding positively to our invitation, and good to see you all joining us for the launch of this important report addressing jointly development, energy, and climate for Africa. As in the African context, there's no way you can separate the three. I will not talk that much because the report is self-explanatory. And as you may have noticed it by reading it, or at least by reading the summary, this is not just another report, as we have been familiar with. It is an effort that has involved several people, careful thinking, and taken a year with weekly discussion, intensive discussion, contesting ideas, bringing new ideas, new perspectives. But it is essentially harvesting and bringing together our different strands of work over decades. And this includes several of us having formulated both the African Renewable Energy Initiative and the least developed countries Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Initiative for Sustainable Development, just to mention only those two, because there is many other aspects of a report. It is essentially a meta-level report and basically several papers integrated into a whole. For me, it's been very satisfactory to work together on this interesting issue of energy, agriculture, industrialization, climate, economics within a development framework for Africa. And the African continent, and this is an evidence, is home to significant energy sources. And this includes both important proven oil and gas reserves, as well as huge and tapped renewable energy potential. In contrast, and despite these resources and potential, sub-Saharan Africa continue to exhibit the largest energy gap and energy poverty of any region, and then to the detriment of the well-being of its people and the achievement of any aspect of African Union Agenda 2063, as well as the UN Sustainable Development Goal by 2030. More importantly, almost exclusively dependent, the continent is the only one increasing people using charcoal and firewood for cooking, with all the different consequences on women and children. And during the past 30 years, the continent has been subject to all kinds of projects on energy. And it is very hard to find out any tangible results of these initiatives is solving what is now been as many a nightmare for the continent, because energy is a critical problem, and then electricity shortage and blackout, we can see it everywhere in the continent. And those initiatives has not looked at the fundamental causes of the energy poverty of the continent. They did not address clearly the development aspect. And then the dominant narrative is disconnected from the reality, as we can see. And then the report we are launching today presents an alternative development framework. Alternative in the sense that is differ from and challenges the predominant mainstream notion of development, and a development that first and foremost addresses well-being of the African people. Just to give and to sum up, we have looked at where are we coming from. That's very important, because unless we know where we are coming from, we will not clearly know how we get where we are today. That's very important, and to have a sense of where we are today, it's related to where we are coming from. And then the report explores, where do you want to go? It is not the elites, it is not the African people, what they aspire, what their aspiration, and then it outlines how to get there. And then those are some of the elements we just want to have a conversation with the panelists, and then to have the conversation of those who are attending the launch of this report. Back to you, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Yuba, and thank you for providing that background to the report and the thinking behind it. And certainly now we are sitting in anticipation, of course, to hear much more details about the issues that you've just identified is captured in the report. And so with that, I really have the pleasure of introducing the two next authors who will take us into 2 rounds of deeper dives, well, I think 3 rounds of deeper dives into the substance and the content of the report itself as well. So it's my privilege to introduce Fadel Kaboub. He is the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity and is also with Denison. And after Fadel does his deep dive, he will be followed by Jacob Mulugeta, who is a professor of energy and development at UCL. So they'll be dealing with the next rounds of deep dives into the report itself. Welcome, Fadel, and looking forward to hearing your input.
Thank you so much, Tasneem, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's been a pleasure and a privilege to work with this amazing group of scholars on this report over the last 12 months. So with that, I'll go to the next slide. As Yuba said, it's very important to know how we got here and where we came from, and that's on the next slide. So the historical context of the structural economic deficiencies and structural traps that got us into the situation that we're in today is extremely important. And as everybody knows, we're facing a multitude of simultaneous crises facing the African continent. Structurally, you have to acknowledge and recognize that the colonial and post-colonial structures, economic structures, are extremely important to understanding how we got here and how we could potentially get out of here. And as most of you know, the African continent was not colonized because it was poor. It was colonized precisely because it's extremely rich in natural resources and human capabilities and in potential. And unfortunately, as we transition to the post-colonial era, we did not structurally decolonize the economic system. We continued essentially on the same momentum of economic extractivism to this day. And that led us to not only to the perpetuation of the colonial structures, but the creation of additional structures that created traps that became extremely difficult to escape. And that's gonna be discussed on the next slide. So what are the three structural deficiencies that the African continent in particular struggles with, and the global South in general struggles with? And I have them outlined here very briefly, and we go into a deep dive, obviously, in the report. The first one is the lack of food sovereignty. Africa today imports 85% of its food. The most fertile soil on the planet is on the African continent, and yet we have this structural trap, which I'll explain in a minute. Lack of energy sovereignty, the fact that the vast majority of our countries are energy dependent, including the countries that are big energy exporters. A country like Nigeria imports 100% of its gasoline, and that is a structural economic deficiency that most of our countries struggle with. And then finally, the third structural deficiency is the fact that the type of industrialization that we've pursued on this continent and the global South in general is an industrialization that relies excessively on extractive industries, as in exporting just raw materials, or low value added manufacturing, meaning that we import high-tech products, capital equipment, energy, we import technology, we import intermediate components, and then we use low-cost labor for assembly line type of manufacturing. So the result of it, as you can see from the diagram on the left of your screen, is a structural trade deficit for the entire continent and a structural trade deficit country by country. That trade deficit essentially puts downward pressure on the value of African currencies. And with the weaker currency, everything you need to import the next morning, whether it's food or fuel or medicine, is going to be imported at a higher price. So we're literally importing inflation and risking social and political and economic instability. So what do we do as a band-aid solution? We intervene to artificially stabilize that exchange rate. And we do that by borrowing dollars and euros and British pounds. And that creates a structural debt trap for the entire African continent. And that leaves us within that extractive economic system that I described earlier. Now, some of these are structural, as in going as far back as colonial and post-colonial times. I'll emphasize just the food sovereignty component because it's very important. We have a deep dive on food sovereignty within the report. But Africa used to be the breadbasket of the former colonial powers. And as soon as we became independent, we see the rise of new agricultural policies in the global north, in Europe and the US and Japan and Canada, the former Soviet Union, all of which designed to heavily subsidize production in the global north, which put the African farmers facing a dilemma. If you continue, you go bankrupt and you lose your land. Otherwise, your options are either move to cash crop production for exports, and that means you have to import the seeds, you have to import the pesticides and fertilizers to produce the cash crops that are desirable in the global north, and that has severe consequences in the long term. The other option is to give up farming the main crops, wheat, barley, soybean, and so on, and then move to the cities to work either in the tourism industry or other extractive industries or assembly line manufacturing. And that creates that perpetual debt cycle that we experience to this day. So we're not going to get out of these traps unless we address at least these three structural deficiencies. Next slide, please. So the traditional economic policies that we've been told we should follow for decades are policies designed to allow African countries to generate as much of dollar revenues and foreign currency reserves as possible in order to pay the debt and presumably to generate sources of finance to pay for the infrastructure for the development needs of the African continent. So I'll run through those 5 basic economic development policies that we've been told we should follow, and I'll highlight very briefly why those are actually traps rather than actual long-term solutions. So tourism, for example, sounds great. You bring millions of tourists, you create millions of jobs in the hotel industry and transportation and so on, and you bring foreign currency reserves with the tourism revenues. The problem is when you don't have food sovereignty, you don't have energy sovereignty, the millions of tourists you bring in, you have to feed them, so we end up importing more food. You have to transport them, heat and cool the hotels for them, so you have to import more energy, and you have to import high quality equipment for entertainment and transportation and so on. So you end up importing even more higher value added content within the continent just to support the tourism industry. In addition to that, we're all racing to the bottom because we all have beautiful countries and beautiful places to visit. So every other country on the continent is racing to the bottom by subsidizing the industry via food subsidies to workers, pension subsidies to workers, energy subsidies, transportation subsidies. So you end up with the tourism industry that's actually extractive, and the net benefit of it or the net value of it is not positive at all. Foreign direct investment and export-oriented growth. We're told that, you know, the more FDI you bring in, the more economic activity, you create jobs and you increase your exports. True on the surface, but again, it's a trap because these industries require heavy amount of energy imports. And you have to, again, race to the bottom by lowering the cost of living for workers by subsidizing either their wages, their pensions, or subsidizing the food that they buy and the energy they buy and the transportation and the healthcare that they need. So you end up with an export-oriented industry that imports capital, imports energy, imports intermediate goods, and then uses low-cost labor, subsidized labor, in order to export a low value-added content because we provide the assembly line manufacturing base for the global supply chain. And when it's foreign direct investment, the profits are actually repatriated to the global north. So you end up losing even more. Remittances, I don't have to explain remittances to people on this call. Clearly, there is a huge brain drain for the African continent when it comes to the type of labor skills that we lose with outwards migration. The flip side of it is the remittances, the dollars that are coming in, but is it worth the brain drain? Question mark. Financial liberalization, this idea that we should create a whole bunch of mini Wall Streets all over the African continent to attract foreign investors, financial investors. Well, the way to do this, to convince an investor to move away from London and New York and Tokyo and come to the South African market or to the Egyptian market and so on, is to create this artificially high rate of profit for them, meaning you raise interest rates, you deregulate, you lower taxes, so you end up attracting almost exclusively speculators who want to buy low and sell high. And when they sell high and leave, you have a currency crisis, you have a stock market crisis, and you essentially have a decade worth of recovery to undergo from that. We've seen this in South Africa. We've seen it in other countries in the global north, in the global south, and in Turkey, in Mexico, and Brazil, and so on. Not a good solution. And finally, privatizing state-owned enterprises. Well, once you privatize the airport or the airline or the telecom, yes, you get a few $100 million to pay some of the debt and to kind of refresh your economy for a few months. But once you've spent that money, you can't privatize the airport again in 3 years. You can't privatize the airline again, and you lose strategic industries again to multinational corporations in the global north. So we end up with, you know, the standard economic development policies and strategies that are offered by the World Bank, the IMF, and most economists in the mainstream of the profession but they appear like solutions, but structurally they actually reinforce the traps that we discussed in the previous slide. And we go into a deep dive within the report. Next slide, please. So when you take this on a global scale, if you divide the world into two groups, global north and global south, and you net out all global financial transactions, exports, imports, foreign aid, interest payment, charity, debt cancellation, you name it, all transactions, we end up with $2 trillion, 2 trillion with the T, moving from the poorest countries on the planet to the richest countries on the planet. That's the net effect of the global financial and international trade architecture that we currently have. And the reason I have it displayed in this way is just to put it in context with the promises that we've had since 2015 for climate finance at the tune of $100 billion a year. Look at the size of $100 billion of empty promises relative to the actual extraction of $2 trillion. And then look at the Green Climate Fund, even smaller amount of pledges that are yet to be delivered, and put it in the context of actual extraction of $2 trillion a year. And I should add a blank dot with the $0 on it for the loss and damage fund that we've recently created that is yet to be delivered. Again, put it in the context of actually $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction. So if we're going to be serious about the challenges that we're facing, we have to do something about this. And this is our call for the Global South in general, for African leadership in particular, to put forward a vision that is targeting the roots of the problem. And we use the term here, radical renewal of Africa's vision. Radical as in going to the roots of the problem. The roots of the problem are at least in those three structural deficiencies that we've described earlier. Because anything that's not radical, that doesn't go to the roots of the problem, is going to be superficial. And we can't afford superficial, incremental solutions with promises that don't deliver anything or don't deliver enough. And I'm reminded here of the words of Martin Luther King in this context, in the context of the civil rights movement, when he said, I can't afford the tranquilizing drug of gradualism and incrementalism. So we have to be very serious about what needs to be done. In this report, we attempt to sketch and outline some of the structural solutions that need to be addressed immediately. Without going into a deep dive of the report itself, which I encourage all of you to do, the three main radical solutions that need to be front and center on the African agenda are the following. Number one, investing in food sovereignty. You can't have any functioning economic system on the planet without food, without energy. So investing in food sovereignty, investing in renewable energy. My colleague Jakob will give us a deep dive into the potential that the African continent has on this front. And then most importantly, changing the composition of the African industrial and manufacturing system away from low value added assembly line manufacturing and purely extractive industries into higher value added content. And here's in 2 sentences the key message about a Pan-African industrial policy. Why Pan-African? Because you can't industrialize on a small scale. In order for you to hit the economies of scale needed that lower the cost per unit, that improve competitiveness and quality and so on, you need access to a large market in order to hit those economies of scale. Currently, the only large market you're allowed into is a market that's already saturated and dominated by global north multinational corporations. So the only space they give you is assembly line of components that they give you permission to assemble. I'll give you one example of one potential Pan-African industrial policy, which connects us directly to energy and food. We have all the critical minerals that we need on this continent. We have the human capabilities, and we can use our economic diplomacy to partner with countries that have the technological know-how for manufacturing. It could be China, it could be Germany, it could be Japan, it could be any partner on the planet. But we do have the market need also. We have 600 million people on this continent who don't have access to any electricity. So this is the potential to use the resources that we have, the human capabilities that we have to put forward an industrial policy that is Pan-African by design in order to reach those economies of scale. And endogenous technological development comes from that kind of industrial policy. And once you do the renewable energy part, you can move to the next part of industrialization, which is focusing on all the equipments and needs for the agricultural industry in order to double down on our food sovereignty needs and so on. So these are the kinds of strategies that we provide much further detail within the report to address these issues. And with that, I'll transition to the next slide and hand it over to my colleague, Jakob, who will give us a deep dive into the energy sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Fadel. Beautiful presentation. Thank you, and pleasure to be here as well. And thank you all for joining us. I mean, this bit is really a deep dive into the energy part of the report. Again, when I mean a deep dive, it's you know, we would encourage you to go into the report and read more about it. So this is really a snippet what I would be presenting. And the reason why we're spotlighting energy is it's at the core of the development and climate crisis that we are facing at the moment. And of course, energy also cuts across economic and social activities, and hence we are spotlighting this. So by now, it is clear from Yuba's and Fadel's presentation that we are proposing a different approach to what we've been doing, essentially a break from the past. But just to illustrate what to talk about this particular slide, you'll see on the one hand the countries on the top right side, and here the US is labeled. So on the one hand, you know, we have the wealthy countries that are overwhelmingly consuming, in other words, you know, over consuming resources through their heavy footprint in terms of their material and energy consumption. Now, this is unsustainable, and their consumption level cannot be used as a blueprint for development, even if those countries you know, decide to go 100% renewables. Unless their consumption levels, the per capita consumption levels come down, we will still face major problems because minerals have to be mined in order to be able to supply energy services. So that's one part of the conundrum. And on the other hand of the spectrum are countries in Africa whose per capita footprint on resources is very light. But this also correlates with the levels of poverty and maldevelopment that countries are facing. So we can pull out some of the scandalous statistics, such as the one that Fadel just indicated, that 600 million Africans not having access to electrification. This is an illustration. And again, this is not only unsustainable, but it's also unjust. So we have to imagine that another world has to be possible if the global transition is expected to be just and fair, where the wealthy maintain, of course, their well-being, and for those in Africa are able to see significant improvements in their services and well-being. But to do this by taking cleaner pathways that preserve environmental and social value. So in essence, there has to be movement from the global north to limit their levels of consumption, and for those in the global south, particularly in Africa, to begin to enhance their services in order to be able to address their human well-being needs. Next slide, please. So we need a transition on all fronts. So for far too long, energy planners, for example, have followed the same model as done elsewhere, energy planners in Africa. Now, this is based on centralized systems as the norm, where energy is generated in one place and transported hundreds of kilometers to the final users. Now, we're not proposing doing away with this, with such infrastructure development, but other models need to be part of the multiplicity of solutions. So, for example, the coming of age of renewables in terms of technological maturity and increasingly favorable costs, it opens up opportunities to consider other types of delivery models. Here we're talking about distributed delivery models that could still be interconnected to serve human needs. So an integrated energy solutions that brings together the advantages of both centralized and decentralized approaches, able to address the range of energy requirements across African societies, is something that we are proposing. Now, this implies the emergence of new institutions and new thinking that facilitates and enables diverse ownership and participation in the design of energy solutions. Next slide, please. Our report highlights several key principles. These are provided in much detail in the report. We invite you to read the report, please. So I will not go into any detail, but place a spotlight on one or two of them. Now, the first is that Africans need to have greater ownership and agency in the way that they develop their energy infrastructures, for that to be compatible with their development agenda. Now, currently, numerous energy systems and just transition initiatives are being launched as we speak that relate to Africa. But often these efforts are often controlled, distorted by powerful and vested interests. Now, we need to move away from this, and this is something which was encapsulated in Fadel's earlier presentation. So Africa needs to find its own voice and ensure that development and energy challenges are internally generated, debated, and acted upon that bring, of course, a wide spectrum, a wide representation of participants as a way to democratize the energy platform itself. Now, one key element here is that for many African countries, the bulk of the infrastructure is yet to be built. Now, this affords countries to think about opportunities to avoid outmoded models of designing energy systems in isolation from the wider economic and social landscape. Now, this means energy as an enabler and social and economic transformation that needs to be embedded deeply in the thinking of energy planners and energy policy makers as a way to envision a people-centered energy system for the future. Next slide, please. Now, Fadel has talked about the structural pitfalls Africa needs to avoid. I would reiterate that African countries cannot be victim to the extractivist model of development that we've seen so far, where they supply low-value content, export low-value content in the form of raw materials, and import high-value content in the form of finished, in this case, renewable energy, for example. Now, this model will run against the same structural contradiction as what happens when countries are locked into a colonially inherited pattern of commodity dependence. Now, what this means then is that the global decarbonization agenda cannot be arranged in ways that subjects Africans into the same colonial arrangements, where they absorb all the impacts and the risks, but little of the benefits. Next slide, please. This is my final slide. So there is at the moment, a major sort of contestation for Africa's future in the pantheon of geopolitics of energy. And I think Fadel will go into a bit more detail in the next tranche of his presentation. But what cannot be acceptable is for African countries to be locked deeper into the fossil fuel infrastructure, while the rest of the world, in the case of Europe, for example, is moving in their decarbonization journey. The Russian invasion, for example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has underscored that Europe's short-term interest, but as we know, they are also moving towards a renewable energy pathway as their long-term trajectory. So we should not lose sight of these geopolitical movements that are taking place. Now, the extraction of fossil fuel resources or even renewable energy minerals for export and rent has not served African interests in the past. And no, there is no reason why we should assume that it will in the future. The economic logic says that it cannot. Now, these are the issues that are very much embedded in this report. Again, we invite you to read the report, give it as much critique as you want. Let's create an open debate about the issues. Now I will hand over to Fadel, and just to illustrate here, as a backdrop to our conversation, Africa has immense renewable energy potential, as illustrated in this map. It has the largest renewable energy potential. There's no reason why this potential cannot be developed, but it has to be developed in ways that are beneficial for Africa in terms of, creating value, in terms of creating employment, jobs, and social security for its citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakob. So now the question that's probably in everybody's mind is, how are we going to pay for it? We have all this potential. We have the resources and the human capability. So how do we finance this transition on the African continent? And generally speaking, the mainstream interpretation of how we pay for development usually relies on more external financing, more debt, and they argue, well, you're already too indebted, we're not going to lend you more, we're not going to provide more funding. What we argue in the report is that there's a way to do it, and there's the domestic mobilization of resources that has to be part of the solution, and I'll illustrate with an example. But there's also something that needs to be done about the international financial architecture in order for it to end the extraction of those $2 trillion from the global south and to reverse the flow of funds. And therefore, the reform of the international financial system and the international trade system must be part of the solution. So with that, I'd like to address first domestic resources, mobilizing domestic resources as in African governments spending in their own national currency, not with foreign currency reserves, in order to build productive capacity. So the usual objection to, say, a government running a deficit, domestic deficit, and the national currencies that is going to bankrupt the country is going to cause inflation or hyperinflation. And yes, absolutely, the real limit to how much a government can spend domestically, that's what we call the fiscal policy space available to each country, is constrained by the risk of inflation. And indeed, the risk of inflation comes from two basic sources. The first one is what we call the lack of productive capacity. In other words, if a country is spending and investing domestically, but it doesn't have the physical resources, the skilled labor, the logistical capabilities, the technical know-how, then that spending would lead to more imports and would lead to more inflation and pressure on the exchange rate. So that is a real constraint. But if we have the domestic productive capacity, which the good news is domestic productive capacity is producible. We can produce the skills, we can produce the equipment. That means the more of the productive capacity you mobilize domestically, the less risk of inflation we have. Number two, the risk of inflation comes from what we call abusive market power. That is to say, entities both domestically and internationally that can raise prices simply because they can, because they have the market power to do it. So that kind of inflation risk that comes from abusive market power, the only way to get rid of it or minimize it is not by divesting from the strategic industries that we need. It's actually by taxing and regulating that abusive market power out of existence. So the key lesson for mobilizing domestic resources is, number one, invest in productive capacity, mobilize productive capacity. Number two, tax and regulate abusive market power, crack down on corruption. And that allows you to invest with your domestic resources, not with foreign currency reserves, and over time, increase the fiscal policy space available to you to mobilize for national priorities, whether it's health or energy or agriculture or education and so on. So now let's move to the next slide, which talks about what needs to be done about the global financial architecture, the international financial system, those $2 trillion that I discussed earlier, that are moving in the wrong direction. But first, let me illustrate with a quick example from my own country, Tunisia, a hypothetical example. Let's say Tunisia wants to invest 2 billion dinars, not dollars or euros, 2 billion dinars on health and education. And this is what the mainstream approach will tell us. The mainstream approach will tell us if you do that, you're going to have more imports of food, energy, and medical equipment. Tunisia is going to end up with a larger trade deficit, which weakens the value of its currency, so a weaker exchange rate. And we're going to have an inflation pass-through effect because we import lots of basic necessities. With a weak exchange rate, everything you import is more expensive, so you import inflation, and that could lead to hyperinflation if you continue to do this indefinitely. And that means the government has to intervene immediately with a band-aid solution, which generates more external debt. So we have to borrow to pay for that deficit. The IMF and other foreign lenders will immediately intervene and say, stop spending. Go back to austerity. And that brings us to square one, less investment in health and education, and we end up with more unemployment, more brain drain, and more social, economic, and political tension. And we hear the classic phrase, there is no alternative. You can't do this with domestic resources. You have to borrow and you have to follow austerity measures, which is what we typically do. Here's the alternative development approach that we discuss in this report. We invite all of you to consider. Again, the same numerical example. Tunisia is going to spend 2 billion dinars of its domestic resources, not foreign currency, not borrowed money from abroad. But now we're going to spend it in a much more strategic way. We're going to spend 1 billion dinars on health and education. And the second billion dinars, we're going to use it to increase domestic productive capacity in key sectors. Food, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and crack down on corruption, abusive price setters, importers of luxury goods via taxation and regulation. So the same amount, but now with a different strategy. We're going to end up with fewer imports of food and energy. We're going to have a lower trade deficit, which means a stable or even stronger exchange rate, no inflation pass-through effect because we're not importing inflation now. We're going to have a lower external debt over time, higher credit rating with Moody's and Fitch and all the credit rating agencies. The central bank is going to have more foreign currency reserves, and we're going to build more resilience to external shocks, such as a food crisis happening because of the Ukraine conflict or other energy-related prices in the global economy. We're going to have a lower carbon footprint because the investment in renewables and domestic resources, and we're going to have more employment, less brain drain, and improved quality of life for all. And now we're talking. Now the question becomes, is Tunisia's fiscal policy space limited to these 2 billion dinars? Is it maybe 3? Maybe it's 4? Maybe it's 7? How do we know? What is the real constraint on Tunisia's capacity to mobilize domestic resources? The answer is, again, the capacity of the government to actually crack down on corruption, crack down on abusive price setting, and mobilize physical productive capacity. That is to say, if we run out of skilled labor, that's our capacity. Then we have to invest in producing more skilled labor for those strategic industries. So the answer to that fiscal policy space is truly in our hands. And that really frees quite a bit of fiscal capacity at the domestic level to fight inflation, fight exchange rate instability, fight the external debt problem, and build capacity internally. Now, on the external sector, again, we said we're living in a global financial and international trade architecture that's purely extractive and neocolonial. So reform is on the table already, not just because of this report, but because of all of us in this space have been discussing this over the last few years in particular, but also historically since the 1970s. So what do we do? Number one, we have to scale up the availability of financing and mechanisms through multilateral climate funds, not just with empty pledges and promises, but actually delivering. But more importantly than just delivering the funds, it's what do we do with the funds? Do we feed those funds into extractive industries, into those structural traps? Or do we prioritize the three structural deficiencies that we highlight in this report, meaning scale up finance in order to invest in food sovereignty, scale up finance in order to invest in renewable energy sovereignty, scale up finance in order to transform the industrial base of the African continent from low value added manufacturing and extractivist industries to high value added industries like we outlined in terms of a Pan-African industrial policy. So both are extremely important. Reform international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, and we go into a deep dive into this. Cancel debts, cancel unfair, odious debts, illegitimate debts that have been paid many times over. Address the issue of colonial debts, address the issue of climate debts. These are all on the table for reform, for debate, for implementation, not in 10 years and 20 years, but immediately. Also, the rules of the international trade system, the WTO, bilateral trade agreements, including intellectual property rights, all of these issues are on the table for reform if we're serious about those $2 trillion moving in the right direction. And of course, the issue of tax evasion, illicit transactions are a huge component of the $2 trillion that are moving in the wrong direction. And then finally, the issue of reparations, and I use the term reparations in particular here to indicate that we really need to repair this broken international trade and financial system. And more explicitly, reparations for colonial atrocities that are well documented, reparations for biopiracy, reparations for cultural heritage appropriation. There is a whole spectrum of mechanisms and tools that need to be reformed and put in place in order to marshal the financial resources that are needed and to repair the extractive global financial architecture into much more balanced, equitable, fair, just, and sustainable global financial system. And with that, I'd like to transition into a brief summary of the key points, that the key messages from this report. Number one, we need another approach to development. So the vision is extremely important, and we try to lay it out in detail in this report. It's not enough to say we have problems. It's important to put forward a complete, comprehensive, coherent approach to economic development that builds on African traditions, and that is truly an African approach to development as opposed to an imported global North vision for what Africa should look like. We must address those three structural deficiencies that we've outlined in this presentation and the report. Otherwise, any other approach that neglects the roots of the problem is going to simply perpetuate the same issues. So food and energy sovereignty are critical. The industrial base of the African continent needs to be re-envisioned on a Pan-African platform with focus on high value added manufacturing and investment in endogenous technologies, that is research and development based on the African continent for the African needs, not simply export oriented to serve the needs of the global supply chain. It's important to mobilize domestic resources, and we have quite a bit of domestic resource mobilization potential that we're neglecting and focusing primarily on how much money we can borrow externally in order to develop the continent. And overall, it's really a report that is inviting all of us to consider a paradigm shift in the space of economic development, moving away from the mainstream approach and rethinking the realities of the African continent, of the global South in particular, and thinking of it not on a national basis, because once you think of it on a national basis, you fail on that industrial part. It's very important to think of it on a regional, sub-regional, and Pan-African space. And finally, we are really eager to invite a Pan-African dialogue, an international dialogue, a Global South dialogue on all of these issues, because they're not unique to the African continent. We can see them in Latin America, we can see them in Asia and other parts of the Global South. So this is an open invitation for all of you and everybody who's engaged in these spaces on climate, on energy, on development, to rethink the paradigm that we're addressing. And in closing, I'll just conclude by going back to something that Jakob highlighted earlier, which is the shifting global geopolitical map and the moment that we're living in. This is the opportunity, and this is the urgency. When you look at the global map, you see the shifting and repositioning of three major economic and geopolitical superpowers: the United States, China, and Western Europe. And if Africa doesn't develop its own vision for where it wants to be in 50 to 100 years, we're going to be part of somebody else's vision. So what are the visions that the US, China, and Western Europe in general have for Africa and for the global north? The vision is very clear. These are blocks that have visions for 100 years from now, where they want to see themselves economically, politically, militarily, and where they see everybody else fitting on their map. And the place they see for us, unfortunately, is very similar to the place where we've been over the last several decades, the colonial and neo-colonial place, which is, it's going to be the place where we extract raw materials, critical minerals in particular for high-tech industries. Africa is going to be the place for the global north to dump its surplus of high-tech products. It's going to be the place for exotic tourism destinations as usual, and it's going to be the place where we can outsource outdated technologies and rely on the continent to provide low-cost labor for assembly line manufacturing to export to the global north. So this is, unfortunately, the realistic vision that these three blocks have for us. It's important for our leaders to do two things at the same time. Number one, continue doing what we're doing in the sense that we're putting out fires left and right because we have crises all over the place. But most importantly, we need to carve out the time and space to envision a position for the African continent, because we do have the resources, the capabilities, the potential. In a sense, the real Wakanda is within reach for those of you who watch movies, right? So this is the invitation for all of us to put together a coherent, complete vision for where we want to be in 50 to 100 years. How do we mobilize our resources, and how do we impose our vision within that global geopolitical space for reforming the global financial architecture and putting forward the resources that are needed for this just and equitable transition? And with that, I'd like to invite my colleague, Dr. Yuba Sokona, to wrap up the conversation and lead us into the Q&A session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Fadel, and thank you, Jakob. I will not say anything more because we talk too much, and then the audience can imagine how passionate we are with this work. The only thing I want to add is that the vision outline in this report need to be contextualized in each of the African countries, because there is no single blueprint that can be applied everywhere. Each country is specific, and then we need to have that. And then we need to know also that we need institutional innovation, because in a classical, the type of institution through which we are operating is only related to the statu quo. New type of institution is needed. And it's important also that we need to bring together immediate need of the people, at the same time investing in longer term issue as that is imposed by the climate change. I just want to get back to Tasneem because people are eager to intervene. Back to you, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Fadel, Jakob, and Yuba again for this truly inspiring. And of course, we can pick up the passion that's gone into this. And certainly, very challenging and very provocative, challenging all of us to step out of our existing paradigms, to look at radical transformation, both in terms of going back and addressing the root causes, but also radical in its nature, because you really going to have to radically transform many of the systems that within current the models and the paradigms of development. So certainly very, very challenging, and we will be having an engagement. I want to remind participants that we will not be taking hands, but please put your questions into the Q&A tab, and we'll build into our engagement with the panelists now responses to those questions. So please engage with the substance and share your thoughts as well. And I want to now shift towards what is the kind of the responses to hear discussants respond to what the authors have presented on the report. And I want to start out by apologizing. Two of our discussants have unfortunately not been able to make it to the webinar. After all, that is Mr. Ali Mohammed, who is the climate change envoy for the Republic of Kenya. He has an urgent matter that he had to take care of. And Suad Aden Osman, who is the executive director of the Coalition on Africa. Unfortunately, we do not have those panelists with us, but we have Mohammed Ado, who is the executive director of PowerShift Africa, and of course the key initiator and convener of this report. And we have Rabia Faruqi, who's the director of Knowledge Management Policy and Finance Center of IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. And we have everybody else, of course, that will continue to contribute. So let me start off with you, Rabia, if you don't mind. We know that this report has certainly forefronted energy system transformation. IRENA, of course, has been in the forefront of advancing the renewable energy agenda globally. And so I'd like you to do two things. First, if you have any general reflections that you'd like to make in terms of the full report and what you've heard today, but then specifically, maybe talk about what you think is needed now that we're not only addressing the issue of energy sources, but transformation of energy systems. And what do you think is needed in Africa, on the continent? What can countries do towards shifting towards just energy systems and not just addressing the fuel sources? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Tasneem, and thank you very much for inviting me to present some of our perspectives on the issue. First of all, congratulations for an outstanding report. I have to say that it's been years since I read work that resonates with me to this extent. So thank you very much, and thank you for your passion for our continent. Now, with great humility, the vision that you set forth in the report echoes some of IRENA's key messages regarding, obviously, the energy transition, especially in our work on Africa. In the sense that as a starting point of our energy transition analysis, we posit that the energy transitions, to be just and inclusive, we need to link it with the wider structural issues. And those need to be really well understood and tackled, in particular, as you say, because of historically rooted dependencies, which continue to hold back development. So what we have done for the past 8-9 years is develop an econometric model that links the energy system to socioeconomic variables. So basically, we take the technology pathways, what would be a business as usual, what would be an ambitious energy transition, and then we translate it into variables such as GDP, jobs, welfare. And we have an Africa market analysis that provides these values, and we try to understand the impact of those ambitious pathways and taking into consideration the sort of the right for development of the continent. So we find obviously that going green, ambitious, and being ambitious on a renewable energy-based transition provides great, impact on GDP, on employment, on the welfare. We have a welfare index that takes into consideration economic, social, environmental, distributional, as well as access dimension. And we do see, a great improvements. But that's a positive overall picture that really masks the magnitude of these effects in terms of the sub-regions in the continent and countries. So we have also values for selected countries. And obviously, as you all pointed out, it will depend on the starting conditions, on the endowments, on the resources, on the policies introduced, and the means of implementation. Though when Fadel speaks about finance, yeah, that's what it is. So we focus on two main aspects in those analyses, which to ensure that there is a positive outcome from this renewable energy-based transition. And they really can form the pillars or the building block, let's say, for some kind of continental framework, such as an African Green Deal, or there should be a better word for it, especially in light of what we've seen in terms of the European Green Deal, which is quite self-serving, etc. So 2 points. One is obviously the adoption of comprehensive policies, and by that we mean to go beyond renewable energy and energy efficiency deployment policies to include those elements that you mentioned around structural change. And let me just mention that those structural changes, the policies introduced very often don't have a price tag on it. And that's a real problem. So obviously this includes diversifying African countries' industrial capacities, developing local and regional supply chains, addressing existing commodity and trend dependencies, and pursuing education and skill building to forge the skilled force that would go into the energy transition related fields. But I think more importantly even is the fact that we've included in this exercise a climate policy basket that covers two main aspects. One that was mentioned quite a bit by Fadel in terms of fiscal policies that need to basically build the modern renewable energy infrastructure, but also invest in that enabling framework and diversify locally and regionally, as I just mentioned. So for example, for several years, we've been looking at how to localize value chains for each renewable energy technology in terms of skills, jobs, and materials. And this is going to be increasingly important given the critical material requirement that the renewable energy industry needs, and it poses really a threat to a predatory approach in the exploitation of the continent's resources and commodities, as we've seen, and you so beautifully put it in your report, over the last centuries. And the second point is that given constrained fiscal space for most countries on the continent, this climate policy basket gives the value, it estimates the value of our international financial flows that must go from the global north to the global south based on historical responsibility as far as climate change is concerned as a starting point for reparation, and HDI, a Human Development Index, to ensure that a step change really materializes. And this provides the price tag needed for what is required in terms of financial flows from the global north to the global south. And that goes beyond the discussions on reforming international financial infrastructure that has served, as we all know, a minority in this world. And we've seen really concrete, actually, examples of hypocrisy around industrial policies in renewables that go against the very nature of the Bretton Woods diktat, but seems to be acceptable to the economically powerful. So these should be, these flows that we have estimated should be in the form of grants, so that go beyond sort of moral, historical responsibility, and they're not in any way, shape, or form thought as a form of charity, but a fundamental right on the part of the continent. So I'm going to stop here and I'll let the others maybe speak a bit, and I'm happy to go into more detail for any of the elements that I provided. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Rabia, and thank you for sharing the magnificent work that you're already doing, and especially in relation to transforming energy systems and not just the focus on renewable energy as a source, but very much part of the system. Now, everybody, Mohammed, in the chat, in the question and answer session, and including me, we would really like to explore something, because everything clearly is inspirational. It makes absolute sense. There's a need for a paradigm shift we've been speaking about for years and years and years. And now this report brings us at a very critical moment, as Fadel had said, you know, there's so many things moving globally, not only the geopolitical shifts, but also initiatives pushing for reform, whether financial institutions, whether the economic order, etc. And of course, the crises are getting worse and worse. So of course, the combination of all of these. So here's the challenge. What do you think? Oh, I mean, we don't have a blueprint for this. Of course, I'm not expecting you to have the blueprint. But our biggest challenge is, of course, landing this politically with political decision makers. And we know the history of our continent also, you know, with, of course, moments in time when we've had the most inspirational political leaders on the continent, post-colonialism and during the independence periods. And then we slip back into the kind of political leaders who are absolutely comfortable about staying within political paradigms, economic paradigms, and kowtowing to the powers that be. So now, at this point in time, how do you think we can land this with political leaders on the one side? Then Mohammed, you know, and we all understand that change, we believe, comes through the power of people. And so how do we use this report to continue building the power of people, but to get to get African people to co-own this vision and fight for this vision, actually, so that the political leaders themselves cannot resist this vision and to implement such a vision? I'm going to leave that to you, Mohammed, to help us understand. There have been a number of questions about it in the chat, and then I'll come to other questions for the speakers. Thanks, Mohammed.
Thanks so much, Tas, and to my fellow co-authors and our discussant. I think I'll use a boxing match analogy, if you allow me. You know, it reaches a point in a boxing match after taking multiple deadly, sucker punches from the opponent, that your knees turn to jelly. You know, you stare right into the eyes of imminent defeat. At this stage, you must either steady yourself quickly and block the punches or get knocked out. Then by sheer deftness, you manage to land a few well-timed blows to put your opponent on the back foot. But just for a moment, you have already tasted blood and now you have a fighting chance. This is a precarious, position our continent finds itself in. Whether it's climate, whether it's energy, whether it's development, whether it's finance, debt, all these things have landed, devastating blows on us, displacing our people, killing thousands, creating this indebtedness. Of course, this is not a match for sport. It's a battle for our lives. But like a bloat, we stand a chance to stay in the ring and possibly to win. And that is a chance, this report, which is, from my perspective, a do or die, both for Africa, tries to actually help provide answers for. Here's an opportunity for us to rally our people. And I want to start with our people before we get to our leaders and get them behind an alternative, climate development agenda that paves the way for Africa and for the global South, I must add, to power, people-centered prosperity and well-being in this era of climate change. From, our co-authors, you've heard, our continent stands at the crossroads we can either continue falling into the same traps that result into continued, dependencies, indebtedness, and fulfilled promises of well-being and prosperity, or we can choose another vision that builds on the very rich tradition of African collective and endogenous cultures. A vision that breaks, dependencies and fosters self-reliance. Not only can African, industrialization benefit from, the new resilient provision of clean energy, it can use renewable energy technology production as, a strategic, early driver in industrialization's efforts. It is in our hands. It's in the hands of African societies to set out a new model for our future that is centered on meeting our domestic needs, not exporting, like we're now seeing, as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this dash for gas, which is largely how, the former, colonial powers have structured our society and economies as a source of, cheap labor and raw materials, but actually use this incredible, potential, whether it's renewables or arable land or our youth population, to effectively build the Africa we want. And this opportunity can only be realized, Tasneem and fellow, colleagues, if our continent can actually look back at the history, more than half a century since the wind of, change swept across our continent, returning our continent to self-determination, our people continue to struggle against poverty, underdevelopment, these things are yet to be won. And so a lot of our people continue to lead precarious lives. And those who have brought, the climate narrative have brought with it a polluter frame and narrowed the discourse to only think about mitigation, i.e. cutting emissions, effectively discounting the 600 million Africans who have no access to electricity, the 970 million Africans who continue to live without clean cooking energy. So it wasn't a question of how do we inspire this energy poor population that is on the front line of climate change, that has contributed the least to the climate problem, to actually help articulate an alternative development vision that allows them to actually leverage the substantial capacity of renewable energy, arable land, so that they can actually develop in a way that delivers well-being, shared prosperity in a low carbon and sustainable manner. So that is what this report does. And I must, as somebody who has been close to this issue and have worked with these amazing, authors, say, our quest for a just transition will be fed and sustained by our collective boldness of character, our deliberateness as Africans, and in the action and in the clarity of purpose that we bring into the discourse. Nothing short of that task is going to help get this on the tables of the 54 heads of states and the ministers and the corporate leaders who actually hold the opportunities and to help actually bring some of these ideas to fruition. I think what we've done through the report, and I'll say shortly what we do now, having put out this blueprint, is that we've demonstrated that climate change, energy access, poverty, development, conflict, the debt crisis, these things are all tightly connected. For Africa, these issues are not just related, they're different dimensions of the same phenomenon. And we can only be able to actually address them if we have a unified approach, the kind that we've outlined in this report, that will help the continent of Africa avert the disaster, but also return us back onto a path of prosperity. How are we going to do this, you may ask? We have an excellent opportunity that I want to put on everybody's radar, and that is the Africa Climate Action Summit that is going to happen between September 4th and 6th. This is an African summit. This provides us an opportunity for us to renew Africa's development vision. And the way we should actually approach as activists, as advocates, as scholar activists, is seize this pivotal moment to rally Africa behind a renewed development vision that is shared and supported by all countries in Africa, but also by our partners in the global south, and galvanize support for it not just from within Africa, but also from Africa's partners. I think we have an opportunity where we don't get boxed into a silo where you think about climate or energy or development or finance. We break these silos. If you had a sledgehammer, start breaking those silos and start thinking about how we will actually strengthen unities, build collaborations, so that this vision for Africa that allows us to avoid the pitfalls of the past that have failed to tackle the continent problems can actually be addressed together using a unified alternative vision. So use it to rally the whole of Africa and Africa's people behind it. And with my civil society partners who are in this call, we've started the Africa Movement Building Space. And that is a space where we're bringing everybody together under one tent. And it doesn't matter if you're doing gender justice, if you're doing economic justice, you're doing tax justice, you're doing climate justice or energy justice. We need all of us together working towards delivering an alternative Africa that is powered by this alternative development vision, a cleaner Africa where our energy is actually going to be 100% renewable. So an Africa that is at the forefront of the global clean energy race, not just trudging behind in the dirty footsteps of the old polluting powers. An Africa that can feed its people, because one of the things we've neglected in our climate discourse is we get easily sidetracked into thinking about mitigation, which is cutting emissions, rather than the opportunity to avoid emissions and grow in a clean, sustainable way. And in the process, we've actually failed to prioritize food sovereignty and the opportunity for us to actually embed indigenous knowledge to help boost Africans' long-term resilience. And so the platform for us to actually think about not just development, but also how Africa can feed its people, deliver industrial revolution, which is so critical, build resilience that allows us to tackle the climate impact. And then the issues that are addressed by Fadel in his presentation. How do we even finance this transition? And a lot of the time, we talk about the 100 billion as if that is the answer. And we all know, we have a huge debt burden that needs to be addressed. And many Africans, are addressing the debt burden within, the challenge of actually tackling climate change. And so a Pan-African partnership that helps us to actually rethink and work together as a cohesive block of activists, civil society, government that pulls the shared power, that is actually united and not divided, that is working closely together and working together to deliver a collective African voice, one that is going to be powerful, not just on climate or energy, but also on trade and other international negotiating forums, so that what we deliver actually advances Africa's well-being and Africa's prosperity in the era of climate change. Tasneem, you've been in the trenches with us in helping to build an African movement of movement. And the reason we're doing that is so that we can actually strengthen partnerships within African civil society. We're now working with experts so that we can consolidate African knowledge. And that knowledge underpins, the kind of transitions we call for. And the next thing is, how do we bring our African political leaders and decision makers so that we can actually forge forward and be able to create the Africa we want for the 21st century. And so you'll be hearing from all of us about how we will, strengthen African civil society capacity, continue to tap into the incredible knowledge of our experts. And I must say African experts here, meaning people who hold, the values, the indigenous values and ideas that needs to actually help power the Africa we want. And then an engagement strategy with our policymakers so that our policymakers don't become the puppets they are, that are actually being used against the African people, but actually help forge and help create the future we want. So it's going to be a partnership where each of us have to actually work together to figure out how we can actually put these spaces in a way that we can create the Africa that is fit for the 21st century. So look forward to engaging you, dialoguing with you, and making this reality. The report is just one part, and it just articulates a lovely vision. But bringing that vision to fruition is on all of us, and not only on the co-authors, as much as they've challenged us in putting this brilliant thinking forward. It's all of you as the food soldiers and as the liberators of Africa who will actually help liberate Africa and the planet and make it safe for all of us.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. I'm sort of galvanized into going Amandla, you know. And so I thank you very much for that. And of course, we recognize that, you know, we are connected globally. These systems are all connected. And so here we would need to take the opportunity not only of ensuring we do this in Africa, but that Africans provide the leadership globally. And we are going to need our allies in the North, the movements in the North to join hands as well, so that they can challenge the paradigms that their Northern governments, with the power behind it, to stop, trying to smash alternatives, which has been the history of the world, right? They smash alternatives always because it's a threat. In any case, but there's a number of questions, and all our wonderful authors are also sitting here. I mean, I really enjoyed the one, Peter's comment about this is happening at a time when the IMF is back on steroids, for example. And a question, really, there've been a number, Fadel, about, the kind of financial system transformation within the context of high indebtedness, and in the short term, probably a continuation of high indebtedness. And then further to that, so how could Africa go on this path within that kind of indebted context? But there's also been questions, for example, about the role of public-private partnerships, corporate responsibility. Are these things mechanisms that still apply within alternative development model? So if you could touch on, a little bit more of the challenging in this kind of transition of the now and where we want to be, the current financial challenges that we have on the continent, and how you would see that moving forward.
Very good question. So I'll start by reminding everybody that the IMF, the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions were created in 1945, when essentially the entire continent was still colonized. So the global financial architecture, its base was designed in colonial times for colonial purposes. So that has to be recognized. So any reforms or discussions of reforms that don't recognize the structural roots of why those institutions were designed and how they were designed, the tools, the financial tools that they were designed with, is going to be a futile exercise in reform. So that's point number one. Point number two, the structural deficiencies that we identify in this report: food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, the type of industrialization, any flow of finance, no matter how affordable it is, no matter how plentiful it is, if it doesn't go towards the structural deficiencies, to undo those structural deficiencies, and in fact goes towards feeding the traditional economic development engines, is going to lead us to nowhere. I'll give you an example. Let's say we have a renewable energy project today in country X that's going to cost $100 million, and we provide the financing for it for $100 million. Just that amount that I just gave you is part of a trap. And here's why. Because a renewable energy project will use domestic labor. Domestic labor doesn't get paid in dollars. Some materials that will be used in that project can be mobilized domestically. So why are we borrowing $100 million when we could be doing the exact same project with $70 million worth of external financing and $30 million in mobilizing domestic resources? I tell you why, and it's not necessarily corruption or somebody putting money in their pocket. It's because our governments are desperate for that extra $30 million because they need it to pay the debt from loans from a few years ago. And the IMF knows about it, the World Bank knows about it, everybody knows about it. And yet, every time we talk about development finance, they say, oh, you need the full amount. And everybody's wondering, where is the rest of the money going? So we're feeding existing traps instead of saying, oh, that debt is illegitimate, unpayable, has been paid many times over. So we're setting ourselves up for additional traps. And I'll say just one word about public-private partnerships. Yes, there's a whole spectrum of public-private partnership types. Some are more extractive than others. Some are more abusive than others. So we have to have a global South conversation on a private-public partnership model that actually works to build resilience, that works for economic and domestic sovereignty, rather than, you know, putting all the costs on the government side and all the profits on the private side and calling it a partnership. So I'm not for a random type of public-private partnership. Yes, there is room for the private sector to partner, but on public sector terms for the benefits of communities rather than for extractive purposes. So I'll leave it at that. Very good questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fadel. And I'm very aware of time, so I'm going to ask for some flexibility because there's some really important questions that I'm trying to not go through individually, but trying to wrap up under particular themes. And so there is a question inevitably about, you know, we have critical resources. We recognize this in Africa, and we've seen Jakob's presentation, especially on energy, so critical minerals as well. And there's a question about what are the political mechanisms for African nations to collaborate so that we can have as much value add and not just have sort of export all of this outside of our region. Now, I both Jakob and Yuba have had really challenging experiences in a previous attempt to build this political mechanism of collaboration through the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative, which was a superb, again, driven by Africans with Friends of Africa, a superb initiative with an amazing vision for a revived and transformed energy system in Africa. But it actually, you know, fell into the political trap where global northern leaders thought this was going to be an opportunity to come and do business in the African continent, essentially, and a whole lot of other things we understood went down there. From that experience, both you, Yuba and Jakob, can we truly find alternative political mechanisms for collaboration? And have you got thoughts on that as well? Yuba, shall we start with you? And then Jakob, you can add.
I think that it is correct, but things are moving slowly, but in the right direction. And I think that after that, we had a number of conversations with different African negotiators and with some of the policymakers. They have to understand that Africa is in a unique position. And the climate narrative of Africa is completely different from the narrative of the other part of the world, because we have unique opportunity. The options, as it has been outlined in the IPCC 6 assessment report, how addressing the climate issues from the mitigation and adaptation point of view, the options Africa has, none of the other continent has. And we have to get out of the bubble of climate, because the African negotiators are trapped in the bubble of the climate. They are not addressing at national level climate issues. They are addressing, responding to the agenda of the UNFCCC, because they said that they are doing the NDC. It's completely ridiculous. And then they have to have their development agenda. And then their development agenda is not incompatible with what the UNFCCC Secretariat is asking for. And this should be, and this is why we articulated that we have to have a development at the center, and then to bring in the energy and the food sovereignty aspect. And then this is taking some time. It's in the making, because, and then the problem also is that our policymakers do not have a clear understanding of the geopolitical nature of food and energy. And then they start understanding it with the Ukraine-Russia issue, because but the way they approach it in the food aspect completely wrong, because the Africans are not eating wheat. And then we are eating cereals and tubercles. We are eating maize, or in some cases on the millet, sorghum, and other, not the wheat. And then the wheat is largely part of West Africa, North Africa. And then the energy aspect also they try to understand. And then things are moving slowly because we have been ahead of time when we developed the African Renewable Energy Initiative. Time was not there, but the political makers start understanding. Jakob.
Yeah, I mean, just add a little bit to that, Taz, and just to also retreat a little bit in the sense that, I mean, when I read this document, for example, or in the course of producing this, you know, this didn't just come out of nowhere. There is a tradition there, you know, at least I speak for myself that, you know, we have a tradition in people like, you know, Sam Moyo, in people like Samir Amin, in people like Chris Hani, in people like Ruth First. So there are people who have attempted an alternative vision in the past. So in a sense, you know, we are, you know, coming from that kind of tradition of thinking freely and openly about the future. And I think, you know, maybe one of the things that needs to happen is to really learn some of the key lessons. I mean, here, for example, you may recall around 2010-11, Ethiopia came up with its climate resilient green economy initiative, which was intended to grow the economy by 15% or whatever, but at the same time also make sure that you don't increase any of your emissions. I mean, this was really radical at the time. The challenge with it was that it was produced by Northern thinkers exclusively, almost like, you know, they were guarding this, even the modeling assumptions and all the rest of it. What we are now beginning to do is to build a kind of the network, because there are thousands and hundreds of Africans, you know, within Africa and beyond, who are actually thinking and working on this issue. So in a sense, you know, we have to build almost like an institutional confidence collectively on how to move forward. So for example, if that study in Ethiopia had been done differently by different, you know, we would still be carrying on, or perhaps, you know, some of that would have been also shared out. So in a sense, you know, there is a kind of an intellectual leadership out there that is beginning to assert itself. And this is really scratching the surface, what we've done with, you know, with this. So the evidence and the analysis is important, but it's also important who does that, and what are, you know, the framings that we end up using. So we have to maintain that intellectual momentum as much as possible, just to kind of respond to I think there were one or two people who mentioned some frameworks. For instance, the African mining framework, AMV, which was put together roughly around 10 years ago. And this was intended to give a very strong kind of rent extraction in mining sort of agenda. Now, it serves its purpose up to a point, but I think, you know, there are frameworks that are out there, including the AMV, including the Agenda 2063, that we would be able to use, you know, and try to build on. So some of the initial work is already there. It's a case of really implementing some ideas, improving upon these frameworks, you know, to the point where we begin to sort of connect, you know, the past with the present, and then build into the future. So I would say, you know, there is a lot of momentum, as Yuba alluded to, as did Fadel. It really is a question of cultivating those and beginning to build on that, and building leadership at different fronts. The leadership, you know, at the CSO level, civil society, how that begins to link up with the policy leadership that is absolutely essential. And of course, you know, in terms of, you know, knowledge, you know, there are hundreds of us out there. The only challenge, of course, is that, you know, we also need to mobilize in order to be able to build the knowledge institutions within Africa to reflect African agenda as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jacob. And yeah, we really run over time now. This is so inspiring that I wish we had longer time because, you know, we, as all of you said, we need to open up the dialogue now, both open up the dialogue and contribute to the richness of this report even further, but also for us to start taking action and trying to get this landed in many places. So I'm going to end off by thanking all of the authors for this amazing report. Thank you very much for your, as I said, you know, your inspiring intellectual contribution to this report. And thank you, Mohammed, at PowerShift. Africa has had this kind of vision for a long time to pull African experts together. So well done to all of you for this amazing report. Thank you for your contribution on this call, the authors, and thank you very much, Rabia. I hope you didn't feel too lonely as the only participant. Jacob, you got your hand up before I close?
Yeah. I'm sure Colin is dealing with this, but there are a lot of questions, really important questions in
Yes.
the what do you call it? The bubble.
The chat.
They've all been recorded, Jacob, and just
yes, of course.
As a note to folks, something that we'll be adding to the website is a place where we can answer some of these questions.
Yeah.
And so everything's been recorded, and everyone who's registered for today, we have your email address, and so you can expect a recording, and you can expect slides, and you can expect hopefully those questions to also be answered online in the future. So this is not the end of the conversation.
Great.
Thank you, Colin. Thanks, Jacob, for flagging that. But certainly, like Colin says, this is the start of the conversation. And that we mean, I'm sure we are going to have many, many conversations. But I was busy thanking Rabia as well, the panelist here. Thank you very much for taking the time out. And in conclusion, I'm going to hand over to Mohammed. I've done my thanks of all of you. I, of course, want to thank all the participants that's joined us, but I'm going to hand over to you, Mohammed, just to make the closing and especially what the next steps are. And so thank you. That's me done.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tasneem, for the excellent moderation, and to all our speakers for all your contributions, and all of you who've joined us in this very important, initial exchange. President Ruto, I think 2 weeks ago when he addressed the Pan-African Parliament, said that the time to engage in gentleman politics in climate diplomacy is up. The window, has long been shut. I think Africans do not have the luxury to wear velvet gloves in the fight against climate emergency, and I'll say in the fight against, energy poverty, in the fight against, underdevelopment. And so the reality is that, the time for bare knuckle fight for the Africa we want is now. And we're refusing to stay in the margins anymore. And we'll be right in the middle of all the important dialogues and exchanges so that together, and I want to say this, not just with my friendly co-authors, but with all of you who've joined us in this important, convening, and are also going to help us enrich the product we've put out there to help rally the continent of Africa behind this vision. I don't think this is something that is going to be won by any one of us. I think the more we pull together and help actually get the whole of Africa behind this vision, for them to support it and then galvanize, that international support that will allow us to be able to meet the demand for the Africa we want. Is going to be on all of us. And so my appeal is look out for future invitations for, future virtual convenience like this, and then an interaction that is going to allow us to hopefully influence the only African summit that is going to actually help discuss an alternative, climate development agenda in September in Nairobi. And I hope we can hopefully provide spaces for us to be able to come together, to think through, how we're going to ensure a lot of the recommendations in this report are taken forward by African policymakers. I think by strengthening our partnership and forging new ones and seeding, all these important spaces with our ideas and ensuring our African, representative, whether it's in the UNFCCC in Bonn in about a week's time, or in Nairobi when African heads of states and ministers convene, or in COP28 and beyond, when they go to these spaces, they will work together closely. They will actually pull together the collective African voice and be more powerful in helping to achieve the Africa we want and help Africa become the force for good in the world, because it's not just about what we want for Africa, it's the world we want. So colleagues, friends, thank you so much. Have a blessed rest of the day. Looking forward in continuing this dialogue with you and helping to make this Africa possible. Asanteni sana, like we say in this part of the world. Merci beaucoup, friends. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
all.
you. Thanks a lot.
Congratulations again. Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.